Hey kids, as you saw earlier today, I put up your next Eagle Song assignment where it was a little different because there's no video attached. It was actual pages scanned in for you to read on your own. If it seems a little tricky for you, grab a parent, grab an older sibling. You could take turns reading, very similar to how we do in class. Also in that attachment was a worksheet, it looks like, of questions, where if we were in school I would actually give that to you, but all you need to use that for is to see what the questions actually are. And as you've been doing, just email me back your answers or message me. Whatever's been working for you has been great. Some of you might have liked that you just got to sit back and listen to the chapter and then understood it just fine and were able to complete the questions. So I'm doing this video of a read aloud for chapter 3 in case you want to listen to it. You don't have to. You can just read it on your own, but I'm doing this for those of you that maybe would just rather listen to the story, which is fine with me. All right, so here we go. Chapter 3, this is just what was assigned today, Thursday. That's not due until Monday, okay? It's called The Great Peace. This is the story that Danny's father told. It was long ago. It was a time when our people had forgotten the original instructions of our Creator. Be good to each other, our Creator told us. Live together in peace. But we had forgotten. Now our people fought with each other. The Mohawk and the Onondaga, the Cayuga and the Seneca, and the Oneida were always at war. It was nation against nation, and within our nations it was village against village. And if one man was killed, then the other men of his village would seek revenge in a blood feud, taking a life for a life. The sun itself loves to see war, our people said. That is why we have such power. And they continued to fight with each other. Now among our people there was one man who wanted peace. His name was Ianwata. He was a Mohawk, but he left the Mohawk people when his sister died. He mourned her death, but the Mohawk people were so used to war and death that they made fun of him in his grief. So he took his canoe and went to the west, toward the lands of the Onondaga. You guys remember him as Hiawatha when we learned it in social studies. I will comfort others who are filled with sorrow, he said, because no one will comfort me. Ianwata had a family, a wife, and 7 daughters. He worried about what things would be like for his children's children. So while he lived among the Onondagas, he spoke of peace. But the Onondagas were ruled by a man who was a sort of a monster. His name was Adadoran, and his mind was full of evil thoughts. His thoughts were so twisted that he had snakes growing from his head. His body was twisted too, so that he was crooked 7 places in his body, and that he had killed many people with his wizardry. He was so evil that he could make birds fall dead out of the sky. Ianwata was a great speaker. When he spoke about peace, the people of the warring Onondaga towns came to the council held in his house and listened to him. His words were good. Now, the people said, we must do something about Adadoran. We must pacify him, for he continues to kill people. We cannot have peace as long as his mind is not straight. This is true, Ianwata said. I shall go to Adadoran and tell him about peace. Adadoran lived in a nest made of reeds in the swamp on the other side of the lake. We shall do this, Ianwata said. We shall go by canoe across the lake. But as soon as the canoes were in the lake, the loud voice of Adadoran was heard across the waters. A storm is coming to wash over you. And as those words were spoken, a great wind came, and the waves rose, and the canoes were turned over. Many people drowned, and the others swam back to the shore. Once again, the people tried to reach Adadoran to bring peace to him. We shall walk around the lake to come to Adadoran's place, Ianwata said. But as they walked around the lake, the loud voice spoke again, and the ground became marshy, and the people could go no further. Each time they tried to reach the monster Adadoran, they failed. Then a terrible thing happened. One by one, Ianwata's daughters died by the evil magic of Adadoran. Now Ianwattha was filled with grief. He did not know how to rid himself of his sorrow. He left the lands of the Onondaga and began to wander. First he went south, up Onondaga Creek. He crossed over Bear Mountain and camped at its foot. That night he heard a song. Ai, Agawayo, ai, Agawayo. So the song began, I, it is good indeed. I, it is good indeed. Its words were words of peace, and he put that song in his heart and held it. The next morning, he climbed the mountain. There, he saw a wonderful sight. A corn plant was growing there on the mountaintop. It had 4 roots and 5 stalks, and on each stalk were 3 ears of corn. A great turtle with a red and yellow belly was dancing there near the corn plant, dancing the dance which we now call the Great Feather Dance. This is a picture of that one. I heard singing last night, Ianwattha said. I was the one who sang, said the turtle. This is the great corn. You will make the nations of the Longhouse like this. The 5 nations will grow from one plant, and the 4 roots will stretch to the north and the west, the south and the east. Then Ianwattha put what he had seen and heard into his heart, and he continued on his way till he came to a group of lakes on a hill. There on the lake closest to him were so many ducks and geese that the surface of the lake could not be seen. Why are so many of you here? Ianwattha said to the birds. At the sound of his voice, they all flew up at once and carried with them all the water from the lake. Then Ianwattha walked across the dry lake bed, where there were many small shells. As he walked among them, he thought of his grief, and he began to pick up the shells and place them in the deerskin pouch that he carried with him. When he had gathered many shells, he continued on his way for 2 more days, until he came to an old abandoned cornfield and a shelter roofed with corn stalks. He made a campfire there. Then, from the fibers of dried plants, he made string, and on the string he placed the shells. When he had made 3 strings of shells, he put 2 poles in the ground and laid another pole across them. Then he hung the 3 strings of shells on the pole and sat there and began to talk to himself. He talked about his grief and how it might be lifted. He bowed his head and talked about peace. Now, as Ianwattha had traveled from place to place, he had heard of a man who was among the Mohawk people. This man, it was said, was a messenger from the Creator. People called him the Peacemaker. His coming had been foretold in a great dream which had been sent by the Creator to all the leaders. In that dream, they were told that the word of peace would be brought to them by a man who was a holy messenger. But even though the peacemaker carried a great message, people were not listening to him. He was not a good speaker because he had been born with a double row of teeth. So when he spoke, his words did not come out clearly. Remember this from social studies. Dagon Awida. As Ianwattha spoke to himself the words of peace, he began to understand. One man alone could not bring peace. It had to be done by people working together. I must find the peacemaker, Ianwattha said, and he turned toward the lands of the Mohawk people. Each night he camped and made a fire and hung the 3 strands of shells from a pole. Each night as he sat, he spoke of peace and said these words. If I should see someone in grief, I would lift these shells from this pole and console him. These shells would become words, and the darkness would be lifted from him. At last, the smoke from his fire was seen by the chief man of another village. A messenger was sent. When the messenger returned and told of what he had seen, a man sitting by a fire, speaking of peace and a way to lift the grief, the head man understood. This is Ianwattha, who has left his home at Onondaga. We have heard of him. He is the one who will meet the great man, the peacemaker. This too was foretold by the dream. So the head man sent a messenger, and Ianwattha was brought to the village. There he stayed until word came to them about where the peacemaker was waiting. They traveled many days, and when they came to the peacemaker, the great man rose to his feet and said to Ianwattha, "Younger brother, I see that you are suffering." Although the peacemaker's words were not clearly spoken, Ianwattha understood them. He told the peacemaker of his grief. The peacemaker listened to his words and took the strings of white shells that symbolized Ianwattha's many troubles. "Now, younger brother," he said, "I shall lift your sorrow from you." So it was that the first condolence was done, and the first wampum strings were used by our people. The peacemaker and Ianwattha formed the plan for a great league of peace. The nations which had been at war would join together. They worked together for 5 years, establishing the Great League. Then they returned together to Onondaga. Adedoran, who had done all he could to work against this league, knew they were coming. He hid himself so that no one could find him. But among the Onondagas were 2 men who could transform themselves into animals. One of them became a bear, and the other became a deer, and they went into the forest to seek Adedoran. When they came back, they said, "We have found Adedoran. He is terrible to see. His body has 7 great bends in it, and his hair is filled with snakes." Then the peacemaker and Ianwattha went with a great multitude of people to the place where Adedoran was hiding. As they went, they sang the peace hymn which Ianwattha had taught the people, the song given him by the great turtle. Their powerful song pierced the air like the cry of the eagle, and they came at last singing the peace hymn to Adedoran's lodge. "I, Agawayo, I, Agawayo." They sang to heal the mind of Adedoran, and when he heard the hymn of peace, he couldn't move. Then the peacemaker and Ianwattha entered Adedoran's lodge. The peacemaker held out his hand and straightened Adedoran's body. Ianwattha combed the snakes from his hair. With his body and his mind healed, Adedoran stood and joined them. Together they dug a hole in the earth and threw the weapons of war into it. Then they planted a pine tree there. The 4 roots of the pine stretched to the north and the west, the south and the east, just like the roots of the corn plant that Ianwattha saw. That tree stood for their League of Peace. Its roots were white like the path of peace, and it was said that anyone could trace those roots back to the pine tree and sit under its branches in peace. On top of the pine tree, they put an eagle to keep watch and see if anyone was going to threaten their peace. In its claws, that eagle held 5 arrows, which stood for the 5 nations of our people. Alone, you can break 1 arrow easily, but when you tie 5 arrows together, it is hard to break them. That is the way we would be. United, we would be strong. Together, we would work for peace. So the Great League of Peace was formed by our Iroquois people long ago. Richard Bigtree paused. "You know what happened to Adedoran?" Danny opened his eyes, almost surprised to see their apartment around them. "No," he answered. "They set him up as the head of their great league. To this day, his name is passed down to the Onondaga chief, who is chosen to head the great council meetings. You see, son, we believe that a bad human being can be made into a good human being. They can even become leaders, so they can use their energy to do good instead of bad. That is our way." Danny thought of Tyrone and Brad. "Are you going to tell that story to my class?" "Do you think I should?" "I like that story. I think they need to hear it in my school." "I think so too," Richard Bigtree said, running his fingers along the wings of the eagle of peace painted on his hard hat. Love it. A lot of that should have sounded kind of familiar, guys, from when we learned about Daganoweda, who they refer to as the peacemaker in the book, and Ianwattha, who we knew of as Hiawatha. So I hope that helped. Remember, you can rewind if you need to, stop where you need to. You will have to go into the activities tab, though, for the questions, because that's where that worksheet is located. All right. Hope this helped, guys. See ya.